We will move on to the next item of business, which is a statement from Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary, on Coronavirus Act's fourth report to the Scottish Parliament. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question of Mr Russell to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased today to be laying before Parliament the fourth report on the Coronavirus Acts. This report covers provisions in both the Scottish COVID Acts as well as the UK Act. It covers the reporting period for the 2 months up to the end of November. The measures in the UK Coronavirus Act and the two Scottish Acts continue to be an important part of our response to the continuing and significant public health risk and economic challenges posed by the pandemic. In addition to the general reporting and requirements under the legislation, we have also continued to report in more detail on 22 provisions which we have judged to be of the most significant impact or interest. We've also reported on a total of 60 SSIs not delivered under the COVID Acts, but where the main purpose relates to coronavirus as required under Section 14 of the Second Scottish Act. The content of the report, and it is a very full report, also fulfils the requirement to take account of available information about the nature and number of incidents of domestic abuse occurring during the reporting period. It also includes examples of the Scottish Government's wider action to support women and children at risk or experiencing domestic abuse. From the outset of the pandemic, we have made it a central objective to put equalities at the heart of our response to COVID. In this latest report, we continue to include information on rights and equality impacts. This is key to ensuring that human rights are respected, protected and fulfilled, and equality objectives are achieved. And we will continue, Presiding Officer, to work to carefully consider recommendations and best practice coming from the work that is being undertaken by the Parliament, stakeholders and others to ensure that human rights, children's rights and equality are protected at this time. During this reporting period, as with those before, we have continued to adopt an approach to extension, suspension and expiry of provisions in the Scottish Acts that is proportionate and appropriate to the scale of the ongoing risks posed by the coronavirus, which reflects our commitment that provisions would not remain in place unless necessary. Turning now to the provisions of the UK Coronavirus Act, there is one provision in particular that I wish to provide an update on in this context. In my statement to Parliament 2 months ago on our third report, and following input from local authorities, human rights and carers organisations, I noted the Scottish Government's intention to bring forward regulations to suspend the provisions in Section 16 of the UK Act relating to social care need assessments as they apply to adult services. And I can now confirm that we have done so during this reporting period, with the suspension ensuring that we can bring back the powers in the future if necessary. There remains, however, a potential for demand in children's services to increase over the winter, and any delays in response times that could leave children unprotected or families without prompt support would be regretted. Ministers have therefore agreed it is appropriate this time to maintain the flexibility for local authorities to use these powers in respect of children's services, where it is essential they do so in order to provide urgent care without delay. Our report again highlights that there are some provisions that have not been commenced, some have been commenced but have not been used either extensively or at all since coming into force. We consider that together these provisions continue to be necessary, either as important tools as we regularly consider protection levels within our strategic framework, or because they may be required to respond to future resurgence of the virus. This report demonstrates that accountability continues to be integral to our efforts to suppress the virus, and this 2-monthly reporting process continues to be a key part of aiding transparency in how powers have been used. However, the Government has also taken account of concerns raised by members during previous reporting rounds. I remember Mr Simpson raising those at an early date about the role of Parliament in scrutinising regulations made to supplement the COVID strategic framework. This Government is always mindful of its duty to be held accountable by the Parliament. There was indeed a debate on that matter yesterday. To that end, Scottish ministers have worked constructively with the Parliament to agree additional arrangements to enhance the scrutiny of such proposals. This weekly cycle affords members the opportunity to scrutinise any proposed changes to levels-based regulations relating to the strategic framework before such changes come into effect. These changes, which reaffirm, although I hope that is not needed, the commitment to be accountable to Parliament, are clearly set within a wider context of regular ministerial appearances in plenary and before committees to give evidence on a range of issues relating to the pandemic. I have myself agreed over the course of this most recent reporting period to attend Parliament's COVID-19 committee as a standing weekly item up to and probably beyond the Christmas recess. My colleague Humza Yousaf regularly appears before the Health and Sport Committee to give evidence on travel-related health restrictions. The First Minister has been reporting on a weekly basis, and I know the Cabinet Secretary for Health has also been here, as has the Deputy First Minister. Since my statement in this chamber on our third report, the Scottish Government has also adapted its approach to the evolving impacts of coronavirus, bringing into effect COVID-19 Scotland's strategic framework. The framework, which came into effect on the 2nd of November, sets out clearly the 5 levels of restrictions that may apply at any one time in Scotland. We want the new levels to be clear and proportionate, a key reason for moving to the approach. Presiding Officer, therefore, let me conclude by noting that, as is required by Section 15 of the First Scottish Act and Section 12 of the Second Scottish Act, Scottish ministers have conducted a review of the provisions in Part 1 of those acts and have prepared this report. We are satisfied that the status of the provisions set out in Part 1 of the Acts of 30th November remain appropriate. We have also undertaken a review of the SSIs, to which Section 14 of the Scottish Act applies. Scottish ministers are also satisfied that the status of those SSIs at the end of the reporting period is appropriate. A review has also been conducted of the provisions of the UK Act, for which the Scottish Parliament gave its consent. We are satisfied that the status of those provisions is appropriate. Presiding Officer, if I may end on a positive point. Within a short number of days since regulatory approval, we are now seeing this very week vaccine beginning to be administered in Scotland. We are, I'm sure, united across the chamber in our hope that after many long months, the corner has been turned in the fight to gain the upper hand against the virus. In the interim, however, we must continue to take all necessary steps to protect ourselves and our vital public services. The provisions I'm reporting on today are one vital component of that ongoing response. We all hope, I very much hope, that the need for these provisions can be consigned to the history books as soon as possible. And until that happy day arrives, we shall continue to do the duty we agreed to report and to be held accountable to Parliament for the use of these powers on a regular basis. This is, as I said, the 4th time that I've reported on this, and we will continue that 2-monthly cycle as required by the legislation. Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity of engagement with the Parliament as it considers this report and as it considers the wider issues.
Thank you very much, Mr Russell. We'll move to questions. Donald Cameron to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Donald Cameron.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of his statement and welcome the publication of the 4th report on the Coronavirus Acts, which, as he has stated, covers provisions in both the Scottish Acts and the overarching UK Act. In particular, I note the mention of the rights of children. Children have been significantly impacted by the pandemic and the subsequent legislation, reflected in the many submissions received by the COVID-19 Committee from children's organisations. Looking forward, the Cabinet Secretary will know that the coronavirus emergency legislation and regulations made under it has a general date of expiry of the 31st of March 2021. At present, and assuming no changes, that date comes after the proposed date of dissolution of this parliamentary session and will occur during the Scottish Parliament election campaign. That being so, can I ask him what the Scottish Government's current intentions are in respect of the expiry of this legislation, and whether there are any contingency plans in place to deal with the potential scenario where Parliament is dissolved, but there is an ongoing need for scrutiny of government decision-making?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Donald Cameron for his question. As the convener of the COVID committee, he is familiar with this reporting process, and he is absolutely correct to say that the Act will expire at the end of March, and indeed there is only one renewal now possible given the terms of the original Act, and therefore if it were renewed for the 31st of March it would expire at the end of September. It is also the situation that the next 2-monthly report falls due at the end of February, and I'm very happy to discuss this with the convener of the committee and then with the wider Parliament. But it would seem to me that if we are, as we will have to report at the end of February, we should also consider the issue of renewal at that time so that there cannot be a hiatus during the election campaign. It would be possible to consider it later than that, but I think at the very least we should start the process of considering what we should do and how we should do it to carry it forward. The next reporting period lies during the election itself, and we will have to make an arrangement to, I think, ensure that that is dealt with in some way. So I would like to commit myself to considering these matters over the next period so that we can come to an agreement across the Parliament about how we would take this forward, which would be the best way, I think, to do it. Given that this is a fast-moving situation, we don't know precisely what the situation will be in February and March, but it would be best to put ourselves in a position still to be prepared and still to ensure that we have necessary provisions available.
Thank you. And that's Sarwar, followed by Andy White.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement, and can I also pay tribute to the public who, due to these acts, have had to make huge sacrifices, people having limited weddings, funerals, hospital visits or care visits. And the Cabinet Secretary references the vaccine, which is of course light at the end of the tunnel, but there is still a long road to go for when we can be completely out of all these restrictions and away from the need for any of these acts. There's also important references to human rights in the Cabinet Secretary's statement. Can he set out, though, what work has been done to limit the human rights violations that many feel have happened in our care sector regarding our care home staff, regarding care home residents, and also the families of those in care homes, particularly in the run-up to Christmas, when people even more sharply will feel the missing of a loved one and will want to be close to that loved one during that period. There's also been references to the scrutiny of role of Parliament. Of course, we had a debate on that yesterday, and there has been a reiteration that we need important statements to be made in this chamber. And I think that is important, but also requests of more data sharing, I think would also be very welcome for members across this chamber and in the public. And also a final request to the Cabinet Secretary, can he look at how we have the flying of kites? Often we have statements put out either by leaking or briefings that happen about things that might happen at some point in the future, or announcements that might happen, and then the public is left on tender hooks waiting to see what the actual announcement will or will not be. I don't think that's the right thing to do. We have already a very anxious public. Can all of these things be looked at by the Cabinet Secretary in this next phase?
Cabinet Secretary, a lot of questions.
Thank you. Can I welcome Anas Sarwar to this discussion? I think this is the first time in his new role he's dealt with this. Just to say on the issue of speculation, that has been raised again and again. It was raised by his predecessor in this role, if I remember. I think it is undesirable to see that speculation. But, you know, we have a free press and people are entitled to speculate if they wish to do so. I also, regrettably, politicians across parties leak or speculate themselves. I would advise them not to do so, because I think it is unhelpful, and we all have a role. And I've stressed this, I think, every week I've been at the COVID committee. We all have a role of leadership in these matters, and we all have a role to say, to give the accurate information, but not to stoke fear or concern. And I hear too often questions that start with the words, people are nervous about, people are concerned about, people are telling me they're concerned about. We should be cautious about that. We should try and give accurate information on all occasions. So I am at one with him on that, and if he can bring his influence to bear on this matter, then I'd be very willing to work with him on that to ensure that happens. In terms of the data sharing, again, the vast majority, virtually all the data is shared. It is published on a very regular basis. Yesterday we saw, difficult sometimes to remember which day of the week it is, there's so much data coming out. We saw yet again all the material being published, the material in each local authority area being published, a number of the criteria being published, and that will continue to be the case. And indeed, the dashboard of information is immensely detailed. So I don't think there's a shortage of data. What is always difficult is knowing where to get at it and how to get at it, and I'm quite sure that we can assist in that in lots of ways. In terms of human rights, we've been concerned from the very, very beginning to ensure that the human rights issues are considered in here, and we continue to be so. And in each area that we consider, as the member will see from the report, we look at those human rights considerations. And the issue of visiting and loved ones in care homes is immensely important. And we apply that concern, the human rights concern, of course, profoundly there, and will continue to do so. And if there are other ways in which we can do so, I am very open to suggestions about how we do it. And finally, Presiding Officer, I would point out in terms of limits, this process has also led to changes taking place For example, in the second Coronavirus Act, there was a lot of debate about the issue of marriage, and we've managed through this process also to continue to find ways to make access to marriage easier, and we should continue to do that. There was a period in which none were taking place. Then we were able, and I pay tribute to Adam Tompkins, who was very deeply involved in this, then we were able to look at the emergency arrangements that were in place, and we will continue to do that. It is very, very hard for people at significant life events to have attendance limited. And I've been at a funeral myself recently, and I know how difficult that is. But it is unfortunately necessary in terms of the emotional intensity of those events, and often what they can lead to in terms of spread of disease, to recognise that they are vectors and to act accordingly.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to see the inclusion of rights and equality impacts in this report. As the Minister will know, I've been concerned about how this Parliament upholds our citizens' right to home, and I welcome the First Minister's announcement that sheriffs will be prevented from evicting anyone from the home until the 22nd of January. Will the Government, though, recognise, however, that this could still lead to a number of people being evicted at the end of January? I see the draft regulations do indeed ban evictions until the 22nd of January, but no provisions are included for tenants living in Tier 3 and 4 areas where guidance already states that they should not be evicted. Will he consider bringing forward legislation that will make sure that such people living in Tier 3-4 can have continuing protections?
Cabinet Secretary.
I want to assure the member, because he has addressed this on many occasions, I acknowledge his expertise in this area and his concerns in this area, but I want to assure the member that his aims and the aims of the Scottish Government are the same, which is to ensure that nobody should be evicted from their homes if that can possibly be avoided. Now, we cannot use the absolute nobody, because there are circumstances, and they will be represented to us across this chamber, where some individuals behave in a thoroughly disreputable and damaging way to their neighbours or in other ways, in which the only solution in the end is to end that tenancy. But in the vast majority of cases, and particularly where because of the pandemic itself, there are difficulties, we should ensure that nobody is evicted from their home. Now, we've managed again to create a set of circumstances between now and the end of January, and I would hope that the member will be engaged in earnest conversation with the relevant minister to ensure that we can create the circumstances in which that does not happen. And we can also create the support that takes place to make sure that those who are responsible for the property, own the property, are also not put in an impossible situation. That is our aim. We share that aim, I hope.
Thank you. Willie Rennie, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Regulations are only brought forward to change a level or a tier. So there is no vote this week to keep Edinburgh, Perth and Kinross, Fife and Midlothian at level 3, despite them meeting the level 2 indicators. So does the Minister think that on controversial non-changes like that, there should be a vote on those issues? And secondly, in England, those with newborn babies can form a care bubble. Can we change the extended household criteria in Scotland to allow that to happen here as well?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the second point, I would want to take advice on that. I would guarantee to the member that he will get a response to that very quickly. I mean, that is noted and will be noted out of the inquiry, but I don't want to make a commitment to it without knowing the full facts. In terms of regulations, the committee tomorrow will have a significant opportunity to comment on what the situation is. And I have to say to the member, I think he's been to the committee on more than one occasion. The committee, if I may put this as widely as possible, does not confine itself to the immediate issue at hand, and will range very widely. And I would be pretty astonished if that issue was not raised tomorrow. The question of a vote on a non-regulation, I don't think is something that we would consider on this occasion. But there is a very serious consideration given. The First Minister outlined in exhaustive detail yesterday what the considerations were in here. And I'm quite prepared to go into it again tomorrow. And of course, there will be consideration given next Tuesday on this matter. I would ask the member, and he is a fair-minded man, I would ask the member to consider, I mean, he looks quizzically at that. He will know himself whether he's a fair-minded man. My opinion of him is that he is a fair-minded man, which may be taken as generous, but it's my opinion. I think he is a fair-minded man, seriously, and a great deal of thought and effort goes into trying to decide that. And one of the factors at the present moment is undoubtedly the issue of the likelihood, I hope it's not an inevitability, but the likelihood of rising infections as a result of the Christmas changes, and therefore that has to weigh upon us as well as every other consideration. But I do assure him there is exhaustive consideration and exhausting consideration of what is the right thing at this particular moment in time.
Thank you. Rona Mackay to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Could the Cabinet Secretary expand on how the Scottish Government will take account of the nature and number of domestic abuse incidents when renewing the operation of the provisions in the Scottish and UK Acts?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the issue of domestic abuse will be a very concerning issue for coming out of this crisis. The figures indicate a rise of, I think, 7% year on year. That is a very concerning figure. The report deals with, and I commend the report to remember, some of the wider considerations, some of the actions taken. But I think we also need to renew our focus on that issue, because the report provides us, as many of us felt it would, and I'm very glad that that information was the requirement for that information was inserted to the Act. I think Pauline McNeill was the moving spirit behind that. I think that now we have seen this, we need to renew our focus and our actions to make sure that that utterly unacceptable set of actions is eliminated. But I think we have in here the evidence that this is something we need to act even more firmly on. And the government is acting and will continue to act, and the report indicates that too.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if I can ask the Cabinet Secretary a question about the regulations made under the emergency legislation. Members cannot amend regulations, they simply have to vote for or against. So even though members might have concerns about one aspect of them, for example, the introduction of a travel ban, and if they support the other measures being brought in, they then have a simple choice either to vote for or against the entirety. Will the Cabinet Secretary therefore consider in future whether issues could be separated in distinct regulations rather than aggregating them together?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think there's an important point in here, and we do endeavour to try and put, to ensure that the legislation and the regulations are comprehensive but clear. And I'll reflect upon the need, perhaps, to separate out regulations more fully, though I'm a bit reluctant to increase the number of regulations. But on the specific issue of the travel ban, I think the publication of the information today should give the member and others pause for thought. There is clear scientific evidence that the issue of travel is a major issue in the communication of this virus and the spread of this virus. And we see that from the evidence published today. We can see it from inter-island travel, and we can see it from external travel. And therefore, I think we should be very, very cautious about using phrases about opposing a travel ban. I am aware that at the committee last week there was opposition, and indeed Monica Lennon moved against the travel regulations. But the travel regulations are an essential part of this, and if the member is doubtful of that, I would just commend to him, and quite seriously commend to him, the exposition on that given by the Chief Medical Officer at the committee last week, which I thought was one of the best expositions I had heard, and I'm sure it reads well too, about why the travel issue is so important and why it should be treated very seriously. It is a difficulty for people, but it is a very effective tool in trying to suppress and eliminate this virus.
Thank you. Willie Coffey to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the importance that any new arrangements of restrictions or relaxations should be as clear as possible for our small businesses, especially the many barber shops and hair salons in my constituency and across Scotland who were delighted to hear that they can open from 6 a.m. on Friday. Would the Cabinet Secretary ensure, as far as possible, that any changes in arrangements that take place over the coming weeks have clear times announced so that our small businesses can prepare as early as possible to let their customers know exactly when they will be open for business?
Cabinet Secretary.
That was exactly what was done, and that is exactly what will be done. It was quite clear that that was what was announced by the First Minister, and that has been warmly welcomed. And I think we should be absolutely sure that a change made of that nature is clear and is warmly welcomed. And I hope the member will join me in warmly welcoming that change.
Thank you. Colin Smith to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, President Officer. The Welsh Government recently updated their regulations on travel to allow travel between Wales and Tier 1 and 2 areas of England, reflecting the fact that England was now out of lockdown. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary why the Scottish Government hasn't done likewise? A constituent of mine, say from Dumfries and Galloway, can travel to meet a family member, for example, in Aberdeenshire, but they can't travel a few miles to Cumbria, where the prevalence of COVID cases is actually lower than it is in Aberdeenshire. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain the logic behind that? Why, in his words, is this regulation appropriate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Because the travel vector remains very significant. I saw that the First Minister was asked this question specifically about Cumbria this morning, and the person questioned quoted an unnamed MSP. I don't know who that was, but the First Minister was very clear in her answer. This is to do with the effective nature of the actions we take to suppress the virus. And travel restrictions are a very important part of that. And as they are relaxed or removed, we have to put into the calculation the likely effect of relaxation or removal. And at the present moment, the view is it will not make any difference if people shout about this. This is far too important. This is far too important an issue for the type of political argy-bargy I hear taking place in parts of this chamber. It is extremely important that we understand, and I again draw members' attention to the exposition of this given to the committee last week by the Chief Medical Officer, a man who is well qualified in this matter, who explained why travel is a hugely difficult issue. And I also go back to the publication of the report today, which proves the point. Now, nobody wishes to see travel restrictions in place. But if there is a view that travel restrictions are unnecessary, that will not help. In fact, it will directly hinder the work that needs to be undertaken to suppress and contain the virus. And no amount of shaking of heads will make any difference to this. Facts are chiels that wanna ding.
Thank you. So I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Maurice Corrie. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is self-evident that the work undertaken to review emergency legislation must be done at pace and within very tight timescales. Can the Cabinet Secretary therefore confirm that there has been ongoing stakeholder engagement and consultation on whether these emergency provisions, continue to be necessary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there is ongoing stakeholder consultation and it's regular and indeed constant. If I might bring myself back to the report for which I am tabling today, this report makes it clear that we take every opportunity to discuss with stakeholders the issues that the legislation has, the issues of regulations. Now, there is a regular relationship between ministers, between officials and stakeholders right across the board. And those are very much listened to and an exchange of information. And I know the effort that goes into, for example, talking to local authorities about these issues. It is absolutely untrue to suggest that in any sense this is not being done with the widest consultation and the widest and deepest thought.
Thank you. Maurice Corrie to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, whilst I appreciate that the Scottish Government regularly considers public protection levels during this pandemic, how robust does the Cabinet Secretary believe the reporting mechanism of the instances of domestic abuse to be, and also the robustness in the flow of information correspondingly during the current pandemic?
Cabinet Secretary.
Let me deal with that in two parts. I mean, of course, there's always a question about robustness of data. But I think the figures that we have indicate this year-on-year rise, which is of considerable concern. Whether that rise would be slightly smaller or slightly larger in different data collection systems, I don't know. But I do think that it points to a fact that domestic abuse has increased during this period, and we should act accordingly. In terms of the wider robustness of the data, close to home for Maurice Corrie, we've seen reported the incident at Faslane. And we know that there have been a considerable number of cases. Now, the robustness of that data feeds through into the decisions that are made, for example, about the status of Argyll and Bute. We heard that raised in the Chamber yesterday and the First Minister's response to it. Now, my own preference would be that Argyll and Bute was not in level 2. But the robustness of that data and the issues that it raises means that a cautious approach requires to be taken. So I think we should have confidence in the data. We should have confidence in how the data is reported. We should have confidence in the criteria that are selected and in the judgment that are then applied to them. Now, it is that final issue that very often the debate in this chamber is about. The judgment is applied to that data, and that is a matter for each one of us. But I do think that the judgment is applied on as a result of the scientific and professional advice we get from clinicians is exceptionally important. And we should be very, very cautious before we gainsay that.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by James Dornan. Mr. McMillan, you're silent. I'm just going to see if we can just bring your microphone up. And try again, Mr. McMillan. No. Mr. McMillan, what we'll do, Mr. McMillan, I'll take James Dornan and I'll come back to you if that's okay. So calling James Dornan.
Halted eviction action until March 2021. But could you outline to me what additional interventions the government have taken to protect renters during this difficult time?
Cabinet Secretary.
I only heard the second part of that question, so I will presume that the question is about the arrangements on rental up until March 2021. If that was the question, then the report deals with retrospective issues, not prospective issues. But as I've indicated to Andy Whiteman, there are arrangements in place in terms of evictions that take us up to January. There are still prohibitions on evictions. And quite clearly, I made a commitment on behalf of the Housing Minister that he would continue to consult on this issue and to discuss with members what further protections are required. I should stress that within the Acts and the Acts on which I'm reporting, we cannot supplement those within this legislation. That legislation exists, the regulations exist, but as we have seen with the prohibition on eviction over Christmas and New Year, additional actions can be taken out with the Coronavirus Acts and their reporting to deal with these matters, and I know that those are kept under constant review.
Thank you very much. Try Stuart McMillan. Apologies, Mr. McMillan, but there seems to be a problem with your sound again. If I might suggest to the Cabinet Secretary whether, if Mr. McMillan submits a written question, whether he can get a written reply. And the Minister is nodding his agreement. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And on that note, we conclude the ministerial statement. We're going to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 23638 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. And could I call on the Minister Graham Day to move the motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much, Minister. No member has indicated they wish to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 23638 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 23639 on the Stage 1 timetable for a bill. Again, could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And again, no member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 23639 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Now, the next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 23640. This is on approval of an SSI, and it is the one which refers to the travel restrictions. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move this motion?
Presiding Officer, the purpose of this SSI is or was to amend the Health Protection, Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Regulations 2020 to move 11 areas of Scotland into Level 4 and introduce travel restrictions for people entering or leaving a Level 3 or Level 4 area. The regulations come into force on 20th November and I move.
Can I double check, Minister, that which of the SSIs you were speaking to there? Because I was expecting the travel restrictions SSI. That's number 389, SSI 2020-389.
I think we have a bit of confusion, Presiding Officer.
Yes, I think that particular one might have been, was that 392? Yes, I think that was 392. 389. Motion 389 is the SSI that restricts travel in and out of levels 3 and 4 and is the one which members at committee moved against and to which I think Colin Smith wishes to speak against.
Apologies, Presiding Officer, then moved.
So that is moved and I believe Colin Smith wishes to speak against this motion. Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the consequences of Parliament not voting or scrutinising COVID regulations until several weeks after they've already been imposed is that those regulations can be out of date when we do eventually come to debate the matter. And that's certainly the case with the regulations on travel. They were introduced at a time when England was in lockdown, Wales had a ban on non-essential cross-border travel, and Northern Ireland were considering what further action was needed to bring the virus under control there. But now England is no longer in lockdown. While there is rightly travel guidance in place, there are no legally enforceable travel restrictions south of the border or indeed in Northern Ireland. And crucially, Wales have amended their travel regulations to allow non-essential travel between Wales and Tier 1 and 2 areas in England. Scotland remains the only country which allows non-essential travel across any Scotland remains the only country which allows non-essential travel in Scotland between low-T areas, but bans non-essential travel between Scotland and a low-tier area in England. The Scottish Government's regulations mean that constituents of mine in the borders, East Lothian, Dumfries and Galloway, can travel freely between those areas and indeed to any Tier 1 or Tier 2 area of Scotland. But they would be breaking the law, they would be criminals if they carried out any non-essential travel to Cumbria just a few miles away, even although I'll take an intervention.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Smith for giving way. I wonder if he would recognise that there are members on this side of the chamber who do have reservations about the travel ban, but because it is contained in a regulation, which contains a number of other measures which we would support, we have difficulty in opposing it on its own. And it would be better to reflect the point I made earlier in an exchange with the Cabinet Secretary, if these matters were separated out in separate regulations, which could then be voted on a standalone basis.
Colin Smith.
I certainly would have no objection to that measure, but what would be really important is if the government actually updated the regulations to reflect changes in circumstances that are happening. We simply haven't had that in place. And what it actually means, and if we take the example that I just gave about non-essential travel to Cumbria being banned, but you could have non-essential travel, say, between the borders in Aberdeenshire, even although the prevalence in Cumbria is actually lower than the prevalence in Aberdeenshire, but that travel to Cumbria is banned purely for one reason and one reason alone, because the regulations ban any travel with Scotland to any other part of the UK. Now, there's no public health argument for such an approach. It is really, frankly, in my view, discrimination against border communities, communities who regularly use services, visit friends and family in the nearest town or city, which is often in the north of England. And this is not, I have to say, Presiding Officer, the only anomaly in the system. And let's be very clear here. No one is disputing that limiting travel is an important way to manage the spread of the virus. No one is arguing against the need, in particular, to avoid non-essential travel between low and high prevalence areas. But the Scottish Government's regulations actually make it a criminal offence to travel between two low prevalence areas just because one of those areas happens to be in England. And that is the anomaly, that is the concern that I'm raising on behalf of constituents. And I have to say it's not the only anomaly in the regulations. I recently highlighted the case of constituents of mine. Who live in East Ayrshire or on the boundary with South Ayrshire, both within the same level of restrictions. Their kids can travel to their nearest school half a mile away in South Ayrshire, but they can't take part in their twice-weekly organised outdoor activity with kids from the same school purely because it's in neighbouring South Ayrshire. Outdoor organised activity is rightly allowed under the tier levels, but the travel restrictions, the travel regulations have failed to allow travel to that activity to be a reasonable excuse or even allow the same 5-mile discretion that exists in the regulations when it comes to travelling for leisure. Now, Presiding Officer, there are lots of other anomalies in these regulations. I think it's the inevitable consequence of trying to enforce a law in complex tier forcing law a complex tier system and not allowing that adequate scrutiny before they become law. It's for those reasons, but in particular, the failure of the government to update their regulations to allow non-essential cross-border travel that I and Labour can't support these regulations today. Presiding Officer, this Parliament and Government is supposed to represent all of Scotland, but passing these regulations today will send a signal that frankly doesn't include the south of Scotland and our border communities.
Thank you. I would just remind members that we're supposed to speak for 3 minutes on these motions, not 5. I also apologise to the Minister. The Minister did address the right motion there. He was speaking to the right motion. I was expecting him to reply, but I'll ask him now to respond to Mr Smith.
Presiding Officer, I don't want to take up any more of the Chamber's time, not least of all when members are concerned about late decision times. Simply to say that these SSIs are brought forward after great consideration, and frankly the idea that there is discrimination against one area of Scotland is reprehensible.
Thank you. And just to clarify, the vote on that SSI will be taken at decision time. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 23641 on approval of an SSI. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move and I think to speak to this motion as well? To move, certainly, maybe to speak to this motion as well.
Indeed, Presiding Officer, the purpose of this SSI is or was to move Midlothian and East Lothian from level 3 restrictions and requirements to level 2. The regulations came into force on the 24th of November, and I move.
Thank you very much, Mr Day. And the next item of business is consideration of 2 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I call on Mr Day on behalf of the Bureau to move 23642 on approval of an SSI and 23643 on committee meeting times?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now, before we come to decision time, I've got a point of order from Patrick Harvey, who joins us remotely. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll be very brief. I'm slightly concerned that during the economy debate this afternoon, one or more members may have inadvertently neglected to make an oral declaration of other financial interests. Not a new situation, but our rules are quite clear. Can you advise how members in this position can quickly correct this oversight?
Thanks very much, Mr Harvey. Thank you for the advance notice and also for expressing your own concern at this matter. However, as members and Mr Harvey will know, it's actually a matter of judgment and responsibility for individual members to decide whether they have any interest to declare. So it's up to the individual member themselves to decide, and they can take any opportunity to do so. So moving to decision time. The first question this evening is that Amendment 23629.3 in the name of John Swinney, which seeks to amend motion 23629 in the name of Jamie Green on responding to parliamentary will and calls for clarity in education be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. So we'll move to a vote and we'll have to suspend Parliament for a few moments just for members to access the voting app. So Parliament suspended for a few moments. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session, so we're going to go straight to the vote. So the question is that Amendment 23629.3 in the name of John Swinney, which seeks to amend motion 23629 in the name of Jamie Green on responding to parliamentary will and calls for clarity in education be agreed. And members may cast their votes now. It's a 1-minute division. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on amendment number 23629.3 in the name of John Swinney is yes 61, no 62. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 23629.2 in the name of Ian Gray, which seeks to amend motion in the name of Jamie Green, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next question is that motion 23629 in the name of Jamie Green, as amended, on responding to parliamentary will and calls for clarity in education be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. This is on the amended motion. That vote is now currently closed. If members have any difficulty expressing their vote, please let me know. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on the motion in the name of Jamie Green as amended is yes 59, no 4. There were 61 abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. I would remind members that if the amendment in the name of Jamie Hepburn is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Alec Rowley will fall. So the next question is that Amendment 23622.3 in the name of Jamie Hepburn, which seeks to amend motion 23622 in the name of Maurice Golden on economy, be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Again, a 1-minute division. That vote is now closed. Point of order, Oliver Mundell.
My phone was saying that I hadn't voted, but it's now just finally updated, so I apologise.
Thank you. Hopefully the new version of the app is actually working, so I'm hoping that's reassuring people. So the result of the vote on amendment number 23622.3 in the name of Jamie Hepburn is yes 71, no 31. There were 22 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. That means that the amendment in the name of Alec Rowley is preempted. The next question is that motion 23622 in the name of Maurice Golden as amended on economy be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Thank you. That vote is closed. If any members did not register their vote, can they make a point of order? Ruth Maguire.
Presiding Officer, I would have voted yes.
That is noted, Ms Maguire. I'll make sure your vote is added to the voters' roll there. Do any other members have a point of order? Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 23622 in the name of Maurice Golden on the economy as amended is yes 94, no 28. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. Now, the next question is that motion 23640 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. And this is the SSI on travel restrictions to which Colin Smith objected and Murdo Fraser intervened. Members may... Sorry, are we all agreed? We're not agreed. So we'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. That vote is now closed. If any members have any issues, please let me know. Sorry, point of order, Jamie Green.
Thank you. I've got no idea if the vote was counted because the screen's gone blank, but it would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Let's just double check. I can see you did vote, Mr. Green. Aileen Campbell asking. Aileen Campbell's asking. And I can assure Aileen Campbell that she did vote. Your vote has been registered, Ms Campbell. Point of order, Jean Freeman.
Officer, my screen too has gone blank and I would have voted yes. Well, I did vote yes.
I can confirm that your vote was registered. Thank you. Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 23640 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI is yes 95, no 25. There was one abstention. The motion is therefore agreed. Now the next question is that motion 23641 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I propose to ask a single question on the two Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does any member object? In that case, the question is that motions 23642 and 23643 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Graham Simpson. However, we'll just take a few moments for members to change seats. I would just encourage all members leaving the chamber to wear their masks, to observe social distancing and to follow the one-way systems in place around the building. Thank you.